Hey everybody. This is going to be the first probably of two lectures where we talk about movies in the teens into the early 1920s. We're going to talk about changing themes in movies. We're going to talk about characters like the vamp. We're going to talk about subversive comedies that were particularly going after those old-fashioned Victorian values. And we're going to talk about the rise of the movie star. Larry May, in your book, argues that Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks were the first true movie stars, so we're going to talk a lot about those two. In fact, let's start with Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford. I love this photograph. This photograph gives us real insight to a changing world and how important movies are becoming. So let's identify people. This is Douglas Fairbanks. This is Mary Pickford. Okay. This is Lord Mountbatten. He was English royalty. He could trace his family back to the reign of Charlemagne. This is Lady Mountbatten, Lord Mountbatten's wife. She was the granddaughter of the wealthiest man in the world at this time. But let's look at the contrasts between these two couples. By this point, Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford were married. I'll talk more about their marriage later on. Let's take a look at the movie stars and how they look. This pose that they're doing with the women on the shoulder and the one leg up in the air, this was a Douglas Fairbanks stunt pose. In fact, in your book, Larry May has a couple pictures of Douglas Fairbanks hoisting people up on his shoulders with one foot in the air. He was famous for doing this. This will be an example of this sort of masculine energy that Fairbanks brings to the movies. He was famous for being strong and athletic, so much so he could put people on his shoulder and do it with one foot in the air. Notice the Fairbanks are copying the Mountbattens are copying the American royalty and not the other way around. Take a look at the clothing. Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks are movie stars. They know what to wear to look good on film. Notice Fairbanks with his contrasting colors, the dark and the light against each other, and how those really pop on film. Same thing with Mary Pickford and how it shows up well on this black and white photography. The Mountbattens are wearing these tweeds or tans, which I'm sure in real life were gorgeous and beautifully tailored. But you notice on film they don't show up very well. They just sort of blend into the black and white background. These were not people that thought much about how they were going to look on film, but Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks certainly did. And not only were they filmed in their movies, but being movie stars, they were photographed all over the place. So they dressed to look good on camera, whether it was still or whether it was film. Look at their movie star smiles. They just look good. They're just photogenic. Look at poor Lord Mountbatten. He's got that famous British stiff upper lip. He's trying to smile, but he's having a hard time with it, not showing up well. Notice the balance and the symmetry of this. Notice the balance rests all with Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford, right? Look at Lord Mountbatten delicately holding on to Douglas Fairbanks' hand. He's not too sure about this whole putting a person on your shoulder and kicking one foot into the air. He's not good with his balance, so he's holding on to Douglas Fairbanks. If he kind of slips, he can do that. Fairbanks doesn't need him. He does it the whole time. Look at how he has one hand going out here, and to balance things out, Mary Pickford has her hand going out the other way. She'd been on her husband's shoulder hundreds of times by this for photographs like this. They're just look at Mary Pickford. She's just so balanced with her hips swung over there, her hand delicately resting on her husband's shoulder. Now look at Lady Mountbatten. She's holding on to Mary Pickford, and look at that death grip she has on her husband's neck. You know, if she starts to go over, she is taking him with her, right? What's fascinating about this photograph is everything in this photograph is telling you who is important and who's not so important. And you know who's important? The American movie stars. Who's copying who? Is this a photograph of American entertainers kneeling before British royalty, bowing down before British royalty? No, it is not. It is a photograph of English royalty acting the patsy to American entertainments. Remember I told you going back to the Victorian era, I told you, entertainers were viewed in a kind of skeptical, disreputable fashion. But now by the time this photograph was taken in the early 1920s, by this time, movie stars, in particular American movie stars, are being revered, so much so that English royalty is emulating American stars. Who looks good in this photograph? The movie stars. Who is holding up and supporting and balancing? Who is the center of this photograph? American movie stars. Right? So it's a really revealing photograph in terms of this shift of the growing importance of the movie star. And so that's why I like to start with this. We'll get back to Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford probably in our next lecture, but we'll see how it goes. Let's talk about changing plot themes in movies. May tells us that early on in movies, when there was bad behavior, sinful behavior, it was often the person or the people that were clearly villains, clearly bad people, that would engage in bad and evil behavior. But as we start getting into the mid-teens, increasingly there was movies that reflected more moral ambiguity. There were storylines where average people, normal people, otherwise good people, were falling into bad, sinful behavior. And the plot revolved around this sort of moral decline. And sometimes the story would end with that person that started out good that falls into sinful behavior, falling into destruction, ending in death, ending in being destitute and losing everything. Sometimes it was a redemptive tale where that person redeemed themselves and returned back to that good person they started out with. But it was reflecting a world that wasn't quite so black and white anymore. A world with more moral ambiguity, where even good people could fall into sinful behavior. Now, one of the subgenres of this new kind of story centered around a character that was known as the vamp. All right? Various female actresses played the character of the vamp, but the most famous was the woman that we see here, and that was Theda Bara. Theda Bara, in the late teens into the early 20s, made a whole career out of playing this vamp character. Now, vamp was short for vampire. Now, she wasn't literally a vampire. She didn't suck blood. But she was this she played characters that had this malevolent sexual force that would go after men and drain the vitality and virtue of men having the same kind of effect as the vampire. Not necessarily sucking blood and bringing destruction, but men falling in love with her sort of dark energy and falling into destruction. Now, again, sometimes in those stories, those men would be led into destruction, death, or losing everything, or sometimes they would redeem themselves by the end. But she played these characters that come to be known as the Vamp. And like I said, there were other actresses that played them, but Theda Bara was the most famous of them. Now, one thing that's interesting to think about is to contrast the Vamp from earlier versions of what we could describe of, and I've talked about, as the virginal heroine. Think of Lillian Gish, who we talked about with D.W. Griffith, and she was the star of his movie Birth of a Nation. And I told you that D.W. Griffith loved Lillian Gish as an actress because she seemed to represent a kind of Victorian virginal virtue. She was beautiful and she was pretty, but in a very non-threatening, non-sexual way. Now, the Vamp and the virginal heroine are actually both, in their own way, very traditional kind of female characters. As objectionable as the Vamp was, the Victorians recognized what the Vamp was. The Vamp was the bad woman. She was the opposite of the good Victorian woman. She was the opposite of the virginal heroine. You could make up a sort of checklist of the characteristics of each, and they were opposite from one another. The virginal heroine was virginal. She was non-sexual. The Vamp was highly sexual. Okay. The virginal heroine was weak and delicate and frail. That all sounds bad, but in the Victorian world, those were appealing characteristics because it was the man's job to be strong and dominant. And therefore, the male and the female balanced each other out. She required the strong man to take care of her and protect her. She needed her knight in shining armor to save her. The story of the virginal heroine was often of getting kidnapped, tied up, laid on the railroad tracks, and saved by the hero. By the way, I don't mean that was a common theme in most movies. You know, that would be a stereotypical theme like this. But the woman would get into some form of distress because she was weak and she was vulnerable, and it was the man that had to save her. The Vamp was strong. The Vamp was powerful. That's one of the reasons why she was objectionable. She didn't need a man. In fact, she often dominated and overwhelmed a man. That's part of what made her bad. If you just do a Google search for Theda Bara, which I've done here, look at all these photographs of her. And one of the things I want you to notice is how she is always staring straight at you in almost all of these pictures, like she is looking through you. Okay. Whereas if you'll look at sometimes images of Lillian Gish, like on the cover of your book, there's Theda Bara is on the cover of your book with a smaller picture of Lillian Gish. You know, Lillian Gish has got sort of this look, like looking away. And even when Lillian Gish is looking straight into the camera, there's kind of a softness to it. But Theda Bara is staring straight through you. To look somebody in the eye is an act of power. To look them in the eye. Right? Remember when you were a kid and you would get in trouble? And you knew you were in trouble. You got busted. and now you're approaching one of your parents. Whenever I think of this, I think in terms of my mom. I got in trouble, and I'm busted, and I know I'm busted, and I'm walking up to my mom, and all I'm hoping for now is to not get punished that much. So how would I approach my mom? Head down, shoulders slumped, mincing little steps. I was taking the form, whether I knew it or not. I didn't know it. But what I was doing is I was taking the pose of a submissive animal. I was trying to tell my mom, Mom, I know you're the dominant creature here. And I know I'm the submissive one, and I know my place. You don't have to punish me that much because I know what I did. Right? And so that's what you do. This is animal behavior. Just, look at animal documentaries and two animals fighting, and one wins and one loses. The one that won the fight has a strong, high posture, and the other animal that just got beat up is now skulking off and slumping away. Right? Nobody had to teach us how to do this. We just learned how to do this, right? Now, maybe you get a little bit older and you were a teenager. And now you get busted, but you're not so afraid of your parent anymore. And so you're in trouble, and you know you're in trouble, but you got a bad attitude. And so now you go walk up to your parent. Wide gait, shoulders square, looking your mom or dad straight in the eye while you're in trouble. They didn't like that. I know my mom sure as hell didn't like that, because to look somebody in the eye is an act of power. Right? The vamp was a powerful character. So in so many of these stock photos, we see Theda Bara with this gaze, this stare. That's the image on the cover of your book right there. She's playing Cleopatra. That was one of her famous roles. Oh, there's a better one. That's the one on the cover of your book, right? She was powerful. Let's go back to our comparison contrast. Lillian Gish was, her character, the virginal heroine, was clearly white. She was clearly all American in that way. The vamp was ethnic, okay, vaguely different, foreign in this way. Theda Bara played a lot of exotic characters in the roles that she played. Cleopatra, for example, is the one I just spoke about. Now, the movie studio created a whole backstory for Theda Bara that would go along with this image. In reality, Theda Bara, her real name was Theolodius Goodman, and she was a nice Jewish girl from Cincinnati. However, the studio changed her name. They changed it to Theda Bara, which, if you mix up the letters, spelled out Arab death. Her background was that she was supposed to have been the love child of a French nobleman and an Algerian princess. That was about as exotic as the American imagination could be 100 years ago. That seemed like a really wild combination. And Theda Bara would do press interviews in this apartment that was made up to look foreign and exotic, with pillows on the ground and incense burning. And the press would come in and sit on these pillows and ask her questions, and she would use this phony made-up accent. Of course, she was a silent movie star, so we didn't hear her voice in movies, but for interviews she would use this fake accent. Now, all of the reporters, they knew this was all phony and made up, but it was entertainment journalism of the time. It was a good story, so they played along with it. And famously, Theda Bara hated the smell of incense, so that once all the reporters would leave, she would throw all the windows open and stick her head out there and gasp for fresh air. So there was this exotic foreign aura about her. And one of the things May argues is it was precisely this foreign exotic nature that allowed her to be seen in a more overt sexual way. See, the virginal heroine was supposed to be like your sister or your mother. Like, that was not somebody that was to be abused sexually. But because Theda Bara looked foreign and exotic and different, those are the kind of women you could use sexually. Right? And so in so many ways, they were flip sides of the same coin. In their own way, both the vamp and the virginal heroine were both very Victorian. They were just representations of what the Victorians thought was a good woman, the virginal heroine, and what the Victorians thought of as the bad woman, and that was the vamp. There was no middle ground between those two initially in the movies. You had to choose. It was one or the other, right? If you wanted to be viewed good, you had to be weak. You had to be domestic. You had to be virginal. If you wanted to be powerful and sexual, you were going to be bad. You were going to be evil. You were going to be threatening. And there was no middle ground between those two. Very old representations of womanhood. The virgin or the whore, and not much in between. Spoiler alert. Mary Pickford later on is going to find a middle ground between those two. And that's one of the reasons why Larry May finds her so important in there. All right. Moving on. Let's get back to our PowerPoint here. Let's start talking about comedies, and in particular comedies that became quite subversive at the time. In fact, to this day, when we think of the most relevant silent movies, the ones that hold up the best are really the comedies. The comedies of Charlie Chaplin, the comedies of Buster Keaton. If you've never watched any Charlie Chaplin movies, I highly recommend. They're amazing. If you had that impression, thinking, I can't imagine why anybody would like a silent movie. It just seems unfathomable to me that somebody could have enjoyed these things. Go back and watch some Charlie Chaplin movies. I got a couple clips from some movies that are in this, so you're going to watch some things. But Chaplin was magnificent. I mean, he was viewed by many not simply as a star at the time, but as an artist in terms of what he could do on film. When you see what Buster Keaton can do, particularly some of the stunts that he pulled off, were just mind-blowing at the time. They hold up really well. If you ever get a chance to go to see a silent movie in a darkened theater with people, sometimes on campus, they have some of these things. If you look for them, theaters sometimes have revivals where I highly recommend the experience of going to the theater on the big screen with a good print. Sometimes the problem with some of these old comedies is the running time on the film isn't good. It's a bit too fast, or it's herky-jerky, and comedy is all about timing. If the timing's off, it's not as funny. So the film has to run at the good time, at the correct time. So if you go to a theater and see it, they usually get a good copy of it, a clean copy of it. You can find these even on YouTube, but there's something great about being in a theater and being with other people, and when they laugh, you laugh. I guarantee you. There used to be a place in Hollywood called the Silent Movie Theater, where they would show silent movies 7 days a week. And I used to tell people, students, to go and check it out. It was a great place with a great environment. And every student that went came back always, and they always told me, I had so much fun. It was so great. It was, and I always recommend, like, go see Chaplin. Um, it was great. But it wasn't just the comedy. There was other things. The original German vampire movie Nosferatu is creepy as hell. I highly recommend Nosferatu if you are a horror fan. You will thoroughly enjoy it. It doesn't have much slasher gore factor, but it is creepy as hell. You'll love it. All right? But the comedies in particular hold up really well. And there's something interesting about comedy. It was true then, it was true during Shakespeare's time, it is true today, that you can really get away with a lot in comedy. You can be quite subversive in comedy because you can always take refuge in the fact if somebody gets offended by saying, it's just a joke. Don't take it so seriously. Even if you are, as the comedian or as the comedic movie, if you are being serious, you can still blow it off as it's just a joke. Hey, relax. You're taking this too seriously. So comedies have always been able to really push things to the line and a bit beyond the line and get away with it more because they always had that fallback when people would get offended or when people were getting mad to say, hey, ease up. It's just a joke. It's just a comedy. And we could really see that in some of the satires we get in the teens and into the 1920s. Let's talk about Charlie Chaplin. Okay, Chaplin grew up in England, and he grew up real poor. I mean, not enough food to eat, poor. And no matter how famous and wealthy Chaplin got, and there was a period of time where he was the most famous human being in the world, and he became very wealthy, he never got over those resentments of growing up poor and his anger against a system and those people that enabled a system that allowed people to grow up in poverty like he grew up in. All right? And so some of his satire, some of his comedy could really be biting against people of power. This image we have here is a still from one of his most famous movies. It's my most famous Chaplin movie, Modern Times. And I have a clip from this movie for you to watch for this week. And it's a scene that's known as the eating machine. And in this machine, Chaplin's a worker. He's from the working class. And a salesman comes to his factory and pitches the owner or the manager with the idea of an eating machine that workers would be basically strapped into, and a machine would force feed them, and the the factory owner or manager is being sold on the idea because it would increase productivity. It would get the workers to eat quicker, more efficiently, so they could get back to work more quickly. Now, it's clearly a preposterous idea. That's why this is a comedy. And Chaplin's character, the tramp, gets selected to be the one that would demonstrate the eating machine. And of course, things go terribly wrong with the eating machine. It's a very funny scene. But behind the humor of the scene is an important point that Chaplin often liked to make in his movies. And that is, this is how the poor and the working class are often treated by people of power. They are the guinea pigs. They are the mistreated. You'll see in that scene, there are men in lab coats and there are men in suits observing. You notice it is not those men that are being experimented on with this machine. It's some poor working class dude that's just on his lunch break that would like a little time, but this is how he gets treated. This was often the story. in Chaplin's movies. As Chaplin became more powerful in the movie industry, he got to control his characters more and more, writing, directing the characters he played. And he played this tramp character. In fact, let me look it up real quick so we can see. Take a look at the images here. Yeah, you know, there's the tramp. Okay, and ooh, that's not very good. There's a better looking image. The tramp character was this poor guy. His clothing was threadbare and ill-fitting. You notice it's a series of contrasts. The hat's too small for his head, but the shoes are too big for his feet. The jacket is too tight, but the pants are too big, right? So he's poor. But notice, despite his poverty, he was trying. He was wearing a suit. He was trying to be a gentleman, right? And so often the tramp character, while poor, while down on his luck, nevertheless, he was the good guy. He was the character with the heart of gold, right? This is in contrast to the way the Victorian middle class viewed poverty and those people from the working class. Remember, the Victorian middle class saw themselves as the virtuous, as the good. They viewed themselves as the moral background of American society. And the poor and the working class below them, they were often the lazy, the stupid, those inclined toward criminal activity. A traditional Victorian would look at somebody dressed in a state like the tramp and look down upon him. But in Chaplin's movies, the tramp was the good guy. He was the one that always tried to do the right thing. He didn't always accomplish it, but his heart was always in the right place. So I just like off the top of my head, a kind of traditional tramp storyline in a Charlie Chaplin movie is the tramp gets off of a long day at work and he gets on a streetcar. And there's only one seat available, and he's relieved. And he goes down there and he sits down. He's clearly relieved. Right? But then afterwards, a woman comes with a small child, sort of wrestling the child, trying to get in, carrying some things, clearly somebody that could use a seat. Now, there's a cutaway to a well-dressed businessman reading a newspaper. And the newspaper, the businessman folds his paper down. He sees the woman. He knows she should probably have the seat. He ignores her. He puts his paper back and is not giving up his seat. Now, he'd probably been sitting down most of the way. He had been, in a comfortable environment most of the day. He could have easily got up and gave it to her. Now, the tramp, who had been working hard all day, he could have used that seat. His feet were hurting. His back was aching. But nonetheless, he immediately gets up and, like a gentleman, gives up his seat to the woman who graciously accepts. And the tramp is happy he could do that for her, even though now his feet are aching again. That's a typical kind of thing that the tramp would do. He was poor. He didn't have much, but he had a heart of gold. In a lot of ways, the tramp character inverts the Victorian idea of who was supposed to be good and who was supposed to be bad, right? And so one of the things about comedy is you really don't want to be the people that are getting made fun of. You don't want to be the people that are being laughed at. And one of the things we notice as we're getting into the teens and into the 1920s, as the middle class is starting to go to the movies increasingly, one of the ways we can really tell the decline of Victorianism is that the children and the grandchildren of the Victorians, the modern 20th century middle class, are increasingly willing to laugh at the pretensions of the middle class itself. When those middle class people were in there in the theater, they were laughing along with this. They thought it was funny too. Their grandparents wouldn't have found it funny, but they were finding it too funny too. And so we see some of that decline of Victorianism even within the middle class. Not only are these Victorians going to the movies now, but they're laughing at these subversive comedies that are sometimes making fun of older Victorian values and traditions. Oops. Another example of these subversive comedies were the films of Mack Sennett. Yeah. Mack Sennett had some of his early success working as an assistant for D.W. Griffith. He helped with some of D.W. Griffith's movies. But Mack Sennett's background was quite different, whereas D.W. Griffith had this Victorian background. Mack Sennett was the child of Irish immigrants, Catholic, a very non-Victorian background. And like anybody in the entertainment business, what you really want, whether you're a musician or an actor or a movie maker, you want to find some niche that's yours, that differentiates you from others, that will get you attention. And one day, Mack Sennett, a light bulb kind of went off over his head, where he realized what his niche was going to be. He was going to be the opposite of D.W. Griffith. D.W. Griffith took all those Victorian values really seriously, and as we talked about before, used some of his movies to try and defend and even reassert those Victorian values back into a modern America. But, Mack Sennett kind of found that ridiculous and laughed at this attempt. He worked for him, but he kind of rolled his eyes as D.W. Griffith took so many of these things seriously. And what Sennett realized and suspected was that there was probably a pretty significant audience in America that wanted to not take Griffith's ideas seriously, but rather to laugh at them. That would be his thing. He would make fun of all the stuff that D.W. Griffith took seriously. And so that's what he did. So we talked about the virginal heroine. And D.W. Griffith, these beautiful but non-sexual women in there. Well, Mack Sennett went in the opposite direction and became famous for what were known as his bathing beauties. In his movies, sometimes as part of the plot line, sometimes not really having much to do with the movie at all. Beautiful, scantily clad women, often in bathing suits, would make an appearance in the movies. All right, here's an example of these bathing beauties. That might not look like a lot of skin to us today, but back in the 1920s, that was a lot of skin. So Sennett became famous for his bathing beauties. If D.W. Griffith was going to have his virginal heroines, Sennett was going to have his scantily clad women. I would get there. And if this caused some controversy, that was fine, because it was Sennett that believed no publicity is bad publicity. So if people were horrified and talked about how Sennett's movies were filled with these scantily clad women, okay, that's fine, because you just let the world know that there was movies with scantily clad women, and there were a fair amount of Americans that in fact wanted to go see movies with things like that. Okay. Sennett was also famous for his Keystone Cops. And these were, he named his studio after these characters. The Keystone Cops were these bumbling police officers that would often cause more trouble than they prevented. So, a kind of typical storyline with the Keystone Cops might be the police department gets a call that there's a bank robbery. Of course, all the police officers are sitting at their desks, falling asleep, and they get themselves together in a comedic way, and they run to the bank, and they're bad at their job, and they're bumbling, and rather than preventing the bank robbery or arresting the bank robbers, they become convinced that the robbers actually aren't the robbers, and they actually wind up take the money out of the bank, put it into the getaway car, wave them off, and somehow they get locked into the vault at the end of the comedy. May argues, representations of authority figures like this would have been horrifying to the Victorians. The Victorians viewed the police as the kind of keepers of order that create a buffer between the respectable middle class and the poor and the working class and the criminals. And police were there to help keep order. Of course, for the poor and the working class, some within those communities often have different interactions with law enforcement, much more negative interactions with law enforcement. So rather than seeing law enforcement as saviors and helpers, they often look at law enforcement as a threat, as problematic. And so laughing at bumbling police officers was often funny for the poor and the working class, who sometimes didn't have the greatest relationships with law enforcement. And again, the fact that more and more in the middle class, by the time we're getting into the teens and the 20s, are also starting to laugh along with the poor and the working class at things like the Keystone Cops, are showing the subversive nature of some of these comedies that are laughing at things that the Victorians in the past took very seriously, and the new modern middle class are willing to laugh at and laugh off. All right, that's a good place to stop in this lecture. In the next one, we'll talk about the rise of the movie star, in particular, Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford. All right, everybody. See you next time.